At the turn of the 20th century, Europe was splintered into multiple alliances. The Triple Alliance united Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Russia and France had the Dual Entente after 1894, and France and the UK had their own friendly agreement, the Entente Cordiale, after 1904. The first decades of the 20th century would begin testing these alliances. In the late 19th century, Eastern Europe was facing significant tensions. The aftermath of the Russo-Turkish War, fought between 1877 and 1878, demonstrated the continued decline of the Ottoman Empire. In the peace negotiations, Bulgaria gained autonomy and Romania earned independence from the Ottomans. Both areas then fell under Russia's sphere of influence. Bosnia and Herzegovina were also granted autonomy while Serbia earned full independence from the Ottomans, but both of these states fell under the Austrian sphere of influence. Perhaps partly out of anger with these peace agreements, Russia had after all wanted all of the Balkans under their sphere of influence, Russia hid out along its eastern border. There, Japan had begun a slow expansion of empire at the turn of the 20th century. Japan had annexed Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, and had forced China to recognize Korea's independence in 1895 after the Sino-Japanese War. Where, Russia wondered, was Japan going next? Russia declared war against Japan to hopefully stop this expansion in 1904. This sparked the Russo-Japanese War, which Russia lost in 1905. During this war, Russia accidentally attacked a few British ships, mistaking them for Japanese vessels. Remember, Britain and Japan had entered into an alliance in 1902. It was not uncommon to see British and Japanese vessels together. Russia's loss to Japan was compounded by this mistaken, accidental attack on the British ships. Only France's intervention with Britain had stopped Britain from military retaliation against Russia. So by 1905, the situation in Europe was quite tense. Russia was smarting from a military defeat and having to sign the Treaty of Portsmouth, which ended the Russo-Japanese War. Russia was also increasingly focused on maintaining control in the Balkans. And Austria was nervous that Russia might try to annex Austrian-controlled areas in that region. Germany just couldn't leave well enough alone. In 1905, Germany decided to test the Franco-British alliance. Wilhelm II demanded that Germany receive trading benefits from Morocco, given that France routinely said Morocco was independent from the French Empire. This demand and the ensuing tensions are known as the First Moroccan Crisis. The French government was outraged at Germany's demands, but backed down, fearing that the UK would not support them in an actual war against Germany, since their alliance with the UK wasn't a military one. Britain's commitment to France, however, remained strong, and with the UK coming to France's defense, they forced Germany to recognize French primacy in Moroccan commercial agreements. This also prompted Britain and France to draw up contingency plans for joint warfare against Germany. A key figure at the Algeciras conference, which ended the Moroccan crisis, was Arturo Pavlovich Nicolas Cassini, an Italian-Russian diplomat who was the Russian ambassador to Spain at the time. Cassini's help with the situation helped bring the UK and Russia closer together, and it helped end some of the lingering tensions from the accidental sinking of British ships during the Russo-Japanese War. Cassini's help also expanded diplomacy between Russia and the UK, allowing for the end of the Great Game. Throughout the 19th century, Russia and Britain had fought for supremacy first in Afghanistan and later in Persia. Ultimately, Afghanistan had become a buffer zone, but tensions remained about Persia. In the 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention, Russia and the UK agreed to divide Persia into 3 zones: a Russian zone in the north, a British zone in the south, and a neutral zone. Each side agreed to accept each other's zone of influence, and both sides agreed to stay out of Tibet. This new agreement between the UK and Russia clearly benefited France, which was in alliance with both states. So, in 1907, diplomats began calling the alliance between Russia, France, and the UK the Triple Entente. As the century moved into its second decade, this meant that Europe was clearly divided into two camps. On the one hand, the powers of Central Europe, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, in the Triple Alliance. On the other hand, the great powers on the European borders, Russia, France, and the UK, in the Triple Entente. In one sense, these great international alliances undermined all sorts of familial relationships. By 1910, George V, Queen Victoria's grandson, was the King of England. His cousin, also Queen Victoria's grandson, Wilhelm II, had become the German Kaiser in 1888. Their cousin Alex had married Tsar Nicholas II in 1894, so Nicholas was a cousin by marriage. These were men who knew each other. Moreover, Wilhelm and Nicholas were not just related by marriage, but were in fact close friends whose families regularly vacationed together. And yet, these were the men who would lead their countries and their armies against one another in the coming decades. By 1905, Wilhelm II had noticed major faults within the Triple Alliance. The first was with Italy. Italian weaknesses were both domestic and international. Unlike Germany, which had established a strong monarchy after unification in 1871, the Italian monarchs had been unable to do the same, leading to extensive domestic problems. As in Germany, Italy's unification had led to a contentious relationship between the state and the Catholic Church. But because nearly all Italians were Catholic, there was no state-engineered Kulturkampf-like suppression of the Church to benefit the state. Furthermore, the new Italian monarch ruled through a premier and a parliament, creating a constitutional monarchy much more akin to Britain's than to Germany's. Yes, Germany had a PM and a parliament, but let's face it, Bismarck had been the power behind the throne for quite a while. As Italy lurched from one political crisis to another in the late 19th century, the parliament also changed regularly as politicians depended on rapidly changing coalitions to push their own agendas. This process became known as Trasformismo, and it described the sometimes pendulum-like swings in political policy. From the Kaiser's perspective, the worst move may have been King Victor Emmanuel III's decision in 1901 to grant the premier authority over all cabinet posts, thereby leaving the king very little authority over government. In addition to all of that, Italy and France remained somewhat friendly diplomatically, which further emphasized to Wilhelm that Germany had only Austria-Hungary as a truly reliable ally. This led the German governing class to think about contingencies. If Austria-Hungary were somehow to lose power or completely collapse due to their fairly regular ethnic struggles, then Germany would be left essentially ally-less. Thus, German politicians began pushing for alliances with other states across Central and Eastern Europe, a region termed Mitteleuropa, including the Ottoman Empire, if necessary. Germany felt that the probable solution to maintaining the status quo revolved around maintaining the spheres of influence in the Balkans and ensuring that any changes were discussed via diplomatic means. In 1897, Russia and Austria-Hungary had reiterated their agreement with the territorial decisions reached after the Russo-Turkish War 2 decades prior. This was precisely what Germany wanted. This reiteration of the agreement did not, however, take into account the growing cultural and political nationalism of the South Slavs living in the Balkans under a variety of governments. In 1898, Russia and Austria-Hungary agreed that Austria-Hungary could occupy Bosnia-Herzegovina and administer it as a territory. This exacerbated nationalist fervor in the Balkans, particularly in Serbia, which bordered Bosnia-Herzegovina. In 1903, a bloody revolution led to the assassination of the Serbian monarchs, and Russia moved quickly to endorse the new king, hoping to promote pan-Slavism and, eventually, bring more of the Balkans under their sphere of influence. Rather than risk a war and risk damaging the balance of power, Austria-Hungary also recognized the new king. But the troubles continued. Serbian nationalists were not interested in the greater balance of power issues. They wanted to just call for Balkan-wide Serbian unity. They wanted to unite Serbian minorities living under the Austrian, Ottoman, Greek, and Bulgarian governments into one state. These nationalists focused initially on the Austrian sphere of influence. The new Serbian government approved a commercial treaty with other Balkan states, including those under Ottoman or Russian influence. Austria-Hungary did not approve of this move, and they responded by barring the importation of some Serbian livestock, including Serbia's most important export, pigs. This battle became known as the Customs or Pig War of 1906. The Pig War ended in 1908 with, essentially, a return to the status quo. But that return to normalcy only highlighted the continued instability of the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Abdul Hamid had brutally repressed non-Islamic peoples within the Ottoman Empire. The most famous of these repressions was the Armenian or Hamidian massacres, which targeted the Armenian subjects of the Ottoman Empire in 1894 and 1895. European powers were alarmed by this news, but unwilling to further destabilize the Balkan region by interfering. Abdul Hamid's repressive regime backfired. In 1908, the same year that the Pig War ended, a group of young Turkish nationalists, the Young Turks, forced Hamid to reinstitute the Constitution of 1876. A year later, in 1909, Hamid was formally deposed. Serbian nationalists in the Balkans used this Ottoman instability to promote their pan-Slavic ideology and break away even further from the Ottoman regime. Austria-Hungary was very nervous about this instability. In October of 1908, fearful of Russian expansion and very certain of German support, Austria-Hungary announced the direct annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina in violation of the territorial agreements reached in 1878 and reapproved in 1898. This annexation prompted the Bosnian crisis of 1908. The annexation was a huge surprise to Russia, since Russia and Austria-Hungary had been secretly negotiating for months about this very issue. Russia wanted access to the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits and indicated a willingness to allow Austria to annex these territories in exchange for that access. Russia was enraged at what they saw as a betrayal. Serbia too was furious because this annexation meant that many Serbs were now living within the Austrian Empire, and in fact, Serbia mobilized their army with Russian support. In response, Austria-Hungary also mobilized their army, but ultimately decided against starting a war at the time. This decision was reached thanks both to the Hungarian opposition to the war and to the opposition and diplomacy of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austrian throne. Franz Ferdinand argued that not only would war be expensive, but a victory would add Serbia to Hungary, not Austria, which would not alleviate any of the tensions with regards to Russia or Serbia, for that matter. Still, the Bosnian crisis left relations between Russia and Austria incredibly strained. Russia pushed to revamp its army in preparation for a real war in the future. The Bosnian crisis passed, but ethnic tensions and international tensions remained. Then, at the start of the 19-teens, focus shifted back to Western Europe. In a new challenge of French power in Morocco, Wilhelm sent a gunboat, the Panther, to Morocco in March of 1911, prompting the Second Moroccan Crisis. The Panther arrived in Agadir with demands that Germany receive the entire French Congo as compensation for France's claiming of Morocco. France refused the demand, this time secure in the knowledge of British support. They got that support, as the UK could not accept the idea of a German port in North Africa, since this was getting Germany a little too close to Egypt for comfort. This crisis, like the first, ended without war, but with compensation. Germany agreed to recognize the French protectorate of Morocco in exchange for 100,000 square miles of the French Congo. Still, worries about the German Navy led Britain and France to establish zones of responsibility for their respective fleets. The French would patrol the Mediterranean, while the UK would patrol the English Channel and the North Sea. Thus, the alliance between France and Britain was strengthened, while Anglo-German tensions increased. However, Tensions erupted again in North Africa when, in October of 1911, Italy challenged the floundering Ottoman Empire by invading Libya during the Italo-Turkish War. Italy claimed victory in 1912, which led pan-Slavic nationalists to consider the defeat of the Ottoman Empire as a springboard to their own desires in the Balkans. Almost exactly a year later, in October of 1912, the First Balkan War began, during which Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Greece declared war on and defeated the Ottoman Empire, so as to gain the independence of the Balkan areas which remained under Ottoman control. Each of these aggressor states then annexed small parts of that newly independent territory. Their success worried Austria-Hungary as it implied a renewed interest in Slavic nationalism, and, Austria feared, as it potentially led to a greater connection between the Balkans and Russia, which was also ethnically Slavic. However, Tsar Nicholas II had kept Russia out of the First Balkan War, and neither the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph nor his heir Franz Ferdinand had been inclined to get involved in the fighting either. The European powers did, however, get involved in the peace negotiations. In the aftermath of the First Balkan War, the UK and France supported Austria-Hungary's suggestion of the creation of an independent state of Albania, which would prevent Serbia, and thus potentially Russia, from obtaining a port on the Adriatic Sea. The German government also threw its support behind this idea, and with the Treaty of London, the European powers then mediated, I'm using the term loosely, the division of the newly independent lands among the existing and now fully independent Balkan states. As you might imagine, these Balkan states, who'd actually done the fighting, were dissatisfied with the peace settlement. That same year, in 1913, Bulgaria, greedy for more land and upset by the provisions of the Treaty of London, attacked Serbia. In response, Serbia and Greece, with help from Romania and even the Ottoman Empire, defeated Bulgaria during the short Second Balkan War. The Peace of Bucharest punished Bulgaria, giving to Serbia the lands which Bulgaria would have received through the Treaty of London. Meanwhile, Greece, which through its ethnically German ruling families had significant ties to the European powers, gained the island of Crete, and the Ottoman Empire regained Adrianople. Serbia thus emerged from the Balkan Wars stronger and more confident, yet also more angry and resentful at Austria-Hungary for limiting the expansion and for creating Albania. And so, Slavic nationalism continued to grow. Some Serbian political leaders sympathized with Bosnia's nationalist organizations like the People's Will and the Black Hand. Still, there was some hope. Some pacifist politicians, possibly including Franz Ferdinand, seemed inclined to invite Serbia into a tripartite empire, which would have created a triple monarchy of Austria, Hungary, and Serbia. But the mere suggestion of this triple monarchy infuriated Hungarians and most Austrians, and it wasn't what Serbia wanted either. In late 1897, Otto von Bismarck met with his friend Albert Ballin, a German shipping magnate who basically invented the idea of cruise ship travel. According to Ballin, Bismarck remarked to him that, quote, "One day the great European war will come out of some damned foolish thing in the Balkans." Bismarck didn't live to see his prediction borne out. He died at the end of July in 1898. But boy, was he ever right.